Hey everybody, this is Jeff at Only Builds. Today we're taking a look at what was supposed to be the bookend end table. I had this idea where I thought, what if we had two ends of a table come together to squeeze in like bookends? That was the original thought anyways. But this is a table for my wife, and she had better ideas. So, what you'll see today is a plan morphing to fit the needs of a client, in this case, the most important one. A while back, I bought this pair of petrified wood bookends from a shop in Eastern Washington on a trip, and they were really interesting. I have them up on a dresser, and they actually hold up a whole bunch of Blu-ray DVD movies. They were a bit of a splurge, I think something on the order of like $200. I was on a trip with my daughter across the state to visit my parents, and I was feeling rather nostalgic that day because I used to live in Eastern Washington and we'd driven through this area many times. This store is in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it is a desert next to a river. There's a bridge that goes over the river. We actually used to take our family's boat down there and go kneeboarding, of all things, back in the early to mid 80s. Fast forward to 2022, and this place has all sorts of bugs and butterflies and beads and crystals and giant dinosaur statues outside. Really neat stuff. So I bought these bookends, and they are a treasure. They're petrified wood. Hello, woodworker. They are my bookends. My wife cannot have them, even though they aren't being used for books. But she is the undisputed champ of reading in our family. And we'll get back to that in just a second. What you see me building here is a template for the tabletop pieces that slide back and forth to make the two halves of the end table. I had a general idea how I wanted the table to look. I had made a 3D model in a program called Rhinoceros or Rhino 3D, and I made a couple quick renderings in a program called V-Ray. But other than a very quick prototype made out of plywood just to kind of see how the general scale of the project would be, I was basically flying by the seat of my pants on this job. So this template that you see here was just drafted right on the piece of wood and created as I went. Now, I read books from time to time. I usually lick the flavor off of these things. Maybe a chapter here, a chapter there. Generally speaking, they are textbook type things. They deal with woodworking or 3D modeling or some sort of graphic visualization. Really boring stuff for everyone else. My daughter is a big reader in school and out of school. She likes to do sports and reads all sorts of novels. I read somewhere recently that the top 1% of readers in the United States read something like 50 books a year. That's a lot, considering a lot of people may never read a full book after they graduate high school. I'm probably closer to that last statistic, mainly because I can't ever seem to finish a book. On the other end of the spectrum, however, my wife has read a staggering 164 books in 2023. Yeah, that's crazy. She has a normal job. She does a lot of chores around the house. Trust me, she has a real life. It's just that any waking moment beyond everything else is filled with reading. This is the beginnings of looking at how the sliding mechanism would work. I found these nylon bushings that fit over this bolt. The width of these bushings is just barely wider than the 3/4 inch black walnut material we're using here, and it was just perfect for leaving a little bit of tolerance between the two halves of the table. The thought here was that the bushing would rotate around the bolt independently, allowing the top table to slide back and forth on the lower table, and that actually worked out pretty well. I like to get in the habit of using a push stick to move debris out of the saw, whether the blade is running or not. After all, that blade can cut through your finger just as easily as any piece of wood. Sadly, this project is the last time I got to use this bandsaw. The Delta bandsaw we see here is most likely from the early 90s. It was my grandfather's saw, who I inherited by way of my uncle. I used to watch the two of them do woodworking projects and on occasion got to help out with a small task here and there. I used this for many years, and one day it made a colossal noise, loud enough to make me not use it for 8 years. I had other priorities at the time, so I wasn't really doing too many projects in the woodshop anyways, but most recently I started a business, and one could say that heavily involves woodworking. And the saw worked for several projects for about 1 more year, knowing full well that there were parts on it, such as the guide bearings, that were seized up. Yeah, using a tool that you know is broken. That really goes against every fiber in my body to use a broken tool, but there was a bit of a nostalgia here, and the tool's expensive, yada yada yada. We just use it until I don't know what. Now my woodworking partner, Kennedy, he was not into this. Shortly after finishing this final project, which was actually a lot of bandsaw work, there was an incident where the blade came off and, let's just say, tried to get me. I had done some research into Delta and found that a lot of the parts for these older saws were just not available anymore. So what we're going to hear is the last time this saw ran. Fear not, the saw was repurposed as wall art for the shop. We get to see it every day, we get to push the buttons, but the big heavy cast iron parts of the thing have been recycled and will be used in some other glorious new bicycle or wrench or tow hitch, who knows. What we see here are the final results of the left and right tabletop pieces. They've passed through the bandsaw and the oscillating sander. Just doing a quick demonstration how the left and right sides of the table will slide in and out. Now it's time to make the table legs. Earlier you saw the layout of all of this black walnut. This is actually the first time I've seen black walnut S4S lumber sold at Home Depot, or any other box store for that matter. I was there for some other project and I walked by and seen it for months, so I thought I'd give it a shot. It's expensive stuff and it worked for this prototyping process, so why not just use something that's virtually ready to go? On the table legs, I wanted a nice thin taper. I had an old taper jig that I've used for decades, but I thought I'd give this Rockler jig a try. It's got all these safety features with hold down clamps and adjustment knobs and a nice push handle. So you just make a few marks on your piece and line it up with the edge of the zero clearance table. The jig's sled board comes a little long, and the first time you use it, you cut through the board so that it's perfectly in line with the edge of the blade. Of course, if you use a different thickness blade on the right hand side of the arbor, the zero clearance aspect of it will continually change. I haven't tried using it on the left side of the arbor, but that may be an option. Beyond the ease of use and the great accuracy, the safety features of just being able to hold this board down and move the jig without worrying about it moving around is great. The old taper jig was made up of a couple pieces of aluminum tubing. You ran it and the piece through the saw, having to hold the two together while you made the cut. A modern product is just superior in many ways. I mentioned earlier how I've been flying by the seat of my pants on this job, which is an interesting saying if you actually stop and think about it. But what I really didn't stop and think about was how I was going to join the top and the bottom parts of this table. In hindsight, a simple lap joint would have done the trick, which would have been two large rabbet joints, one on the tabletop piece shown here, and another on the lower leg part shown here. But again, that was all hindsight, and that is not what happened. We like to use an open back miter saw table, and so we purchased one of these Wood River rail and stop blocks, and it sits on the back of the fence. What's nice is that it can flip out of the way when you're not using it for that part, and we use a regular piece of wood and a T-nut to make a secondary stop block, so we have two places that we can refer back to. So this is one of those moments when you plow ahead with the cutting when you really shouldn't have. What I should have done in a prototyping scenario is make some of the pieces out of plywood and test the joint out first, or draw it up on the sketchboard. Heck, even go into the 3D modeling program. Do something before you start cutting into the very expensive black walnut. Here you see me changing out the combination rip blade for a flat ground box joint blade, which will be handy in the next step of this unusual joint. I've heard the phrase tossed around that good woodworking is the process of effectively hiding your mistakes. I'd like to believe that over time those mistakes start to dwindle, especially if you're making the same type of product over and over again. One would think that you'd learn from your mistakes and not make those again. But if you're continually making new things that you've never made before because you're bored of making the old things, it then provides an opportunity for you to make new mistakes you've never made before. In woodworking, at least, that usually leads to getting to use unusual tools, and this one is the Shop Fox right angle jig. It's made of nice heavy plate steel that makes it feel very stable in the hands. It of course sits in the miter slot, and it has two adjustment knobs that allow the vertical portion of the tool to move independently side to side from the lower horizontal plate. The vertical plate has a series of holes and slots and comes with a couple different devices that attach to it. And these are all very versatile in allowing you to take an unusual piece of wood and hold it in a manner you would not ever run through a table saw any other way. And it feels relatively safe doing it. Although the inspiration for this sliding table came from petrified wood bookends, ultimately that's not really how the client wanted to use this table. She really wanted to have space to have a lamp and a place for her Kindle and a coffee cup and her phone, yada yada yada. There's a lot of stuff that's going to be put on top of this end table, and so it really was not going to have the space to store books, at least on top of it anyways. So what we're showing here is taking a piece of maple and making a very long inlay. I've never really seen anyone do something like this before, so I thought I'd give it a shot, and turns out there's a reason nobody does this. This is a technique that's probably most similar to something you might see in a picture frame, but certainly not in furniture that's going to be bumped around and have things set on it and cats jumping on it. We've got all the necessary parts rough cut here. Got the lower leg and the upper part of the table, and the maple splice that goes in between, which in the end just ends up being a decorative feature. Gluing these things up was no problem. Clamping them, on the other hand, was quite a different monster due to the fact that none of the pieces were square and the joinery was at an angle. I thought I was able to immobilize the pieces well enough, but the maple had a trick up its sleeve by somehow expanding the joint after I left for the day. It just ended up being a weak joint, and the fix for it led to an even greater idea for the functionality of the table. And here's laying out the sliding mechanism where we're going to drill a hole for the bolt and bushings to slide through. I whipped up this little corner jig here. Needed all of the holes on the pieces to be precisely in the same place across the whole table so that the one long bolt would slide through one hole on one side of the table and another bolt on the other side. The two back walls of the jig don't go all the way to the corner so that drilling debris doesn't get caught back there for when you switch parts in and out. And here we're showing the first dry fit to see how everything goes together. This is where I was discovering that the tolerances of the drill holes and that long black bolt were just a little too tight. Also, since the thread on the end of the bolt was only at the very tip, that made it so that there were actually extra parts and the table was going to get smaller if I used those bolts. So I went back to the drawing board and found some all-thread rods, and then I was able to make the table whatever width I wanted to. Just cutting the rod to length and then filing the edges off so that they're not incredibly sharp. The nice thing about the all-thread rod is that it's a little bit smaller diameter than the black bolts that I was using, and so the assembly went on much easier. I had hoped for an aesthetic of all black hardware with the black walnut, so it was a little disappointing switching from the black to silver all-thread and silver nuts, but I think the industrial look of the piece still worked out. As you may notice, I actually broke one of the pieces of walnut trying to get the dry fit assembly off of those last bolts, so I'll have to glue that little chunk back on here, but luckily it's on the underside of the table so you'll never see it. And here's disassembling of the second table, showing what a pain in the butt it was. The tight tolerance between the drill hole and the bolt, combined with there being two of them, ended up making for a very interesting disassembly. And now that we're using all thread, we can get the size of the table exactly where we want it with the nuts and the inset hole, and tighten up the nuts with a socket. Here's when I remembered that you can't assemble both tables at the same time. They have to fit together like a puzzle, Jeff. Take it apart. Ah, that's better. The trick to the sliding mechanism is that the one bolt on the left-hand table has to be assembled in between the two bolts of the right-hand table. This is done by advancing the bolt through a bushing and then advancing it through the piece of wood and so on and so forth until the bolt is all the way through the piece, and you can put a nut on both ends to tighten it all together. I think the underside of this view is pretty interesting. It also shows how the bushings are just a little wider than the 3/4 inch material, so that allows the two halves of the table to slide back and forth fairly easily. Here's where that silly joint at the top led to a revelation of how this thing could be more interesting. I needed a way to stabilize the lower part of the legs because they were just a little too wobbly. So I had this series of metal brackets that were originally intended to just be stabilizer arms. But something my wife had said when I took the table in earlier to bask in the glory of how awesome this thing was, she simply reminded me that it would be nice if there was some sort of storage beneath. So I started to reconfigure these brackets below that would still be doing their job into a shape that would hold a book display. And I'll grab a book from my library out in the shop, test out a couple different sizes to see what is viable, and it made for a pretty interesting look that was also very functional for the user. The next step is to fasten the hardware to the legs. I found these little screws that were dipped in black paint. I thought they were interesting. I'd not seen anything like that before, so they'll match the black hardware nicely. I do have to be careful how many times I use the screw though, so I don't scratch all of the paint off. You may be wondering by now, where did I get these black metal plates? By chance, they were laying around the shop. They were part of an old tripod that went to a speaker stand, like a PA system for a band. One of those moments where you feel vindicated for having been a pack rat your whole life and keeping all sorts of useless crap around the house. Whereas 98% of the rest of your life is spent wondering, why do you have all this crap around your house? As you can see here, not all the pieces were perfect length since the tables are slightly different widths. So I did have to go in and cut a few of these plates down and match the curve that they had on the end, and then of course the drill hole. It wasn't all peaches and cream though. I had just enough of these pieces to not complete the job. So I did have to go buy one of these tripods and render it useless by harvesting these plates that I desperately needed. So then, of course, now I have new parts that will be used for some future project, right? I planned on staining the lower shelf in a matte black finish, so I just grabbed some pieces of scrap lumber around the house and glued them up here. Next, it was time to stain all the parts. And there's a lot of finicky little pieces that would be difficult to set on their sides and dry, so I set up this little jig here. Since every piece had a hole, I was able to hang them all like so. Here's a little fun fact: I've been doing woodworking for just over 40 years now, and for about 38 of those years, I got away with not really ever painting or staining woodworking projects that I would build as gifts for friends and family. I would make the thing and I would hand it to them and say, "You have fun with that." But now I run a woodworking business, so customers now pay me to do these things, so I have to follow through and actually paint and stain and make it look beautiful. I was originally making this table as a Christmas gift for my wife, and things went a little late. I was able to preview the table in its rough draft form for Christmas, and that's when I got some of the hints of what she would like, what she would not like, and I said nothing further about the storage shelves. I went about my merry way, and she saw none of this progression until it was finally revealed. Fun fact about readers is they truly do not care what goes on in the woodshop. They are happy to have you out in the woodshop while they are going about their business of reading every book that they can get their hands on. I joke, but in the end, it was great to be able to surprise my wife with a nice gift. After the staining had cured, we made a makeshift spray booth and sprayed on some polyurethane to keep everything nice and safe. One final assembly process. Man, was I tired of taking this thing apart and putting it back together. Just ready for it to be done. Like most projects, they are a lot of fun for about 75% of the time, and that last quarter you're just kind of wondering, why did I ever start this? But somehow within a day or two you're always just as excited to start the next new project.